Kevin O'Brien, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This is episode number 58. I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited to talk to you today about everything that we have in common in your career and teaching English and bread loaf and lacrosse and really anything that comes up here. So I appreciate the time and thank you very much.
Well, it's really an honor to be here, and Jake. So I appreciate and flattered. Like there's a lot of humility when I was looking through your roster of guests here. So thank you for having me. And I'm a little nervous, I have to say. I've never done a podcast before.
Well, you look great. We're on Zoom. We've been doing this all year, so I'm pretty comfortable with it now. Since when we first started it, it was kind of tough to figure it out. In terms of which way to take the conversation and, how to get the most out of the episodes. But this is episode 58. We've been doing it all year. So just glad to have you. And I think the best way that these podcasts typically go are conversational. So I'm just going to kind of ask you some probing questions as you talk about, your life, your career, and the topics that we both are pretty passionate about. So maybe we can start with your experience playing lacrosse at Penn and actually how you started playing lacrosse, really, because I read that you were a baseball player for most of your life and you kind of got started relatively late in the sport of lacrosse in high school.
Yeah. And so I'm 47. So I graduated high school in 1992, just to kind of, clarify. There wasn't the specialization in sports. So I grew up in Northeast Ohio outside Cleveland and playing, first soccer and then baseball. Picked up basketball just in middle school. I ran middle school track. And then, many stories along the road, but, I ended up at Phillips Academy Andover for boarding school. And I saw kids the very first weekend for the first time throwing a lacrosse ball around and the stick, and kind of witnessed it from afar and dabbled in it a little bit that winter, just because my friends were playing lacrosse. And then I was committed to playing again, sort of the travel baseball circuit after ninth grade. So I knew I was going to play baseball in ninth grade, all summer after ninth grade, and baseball tryouts got rained out. So the story goes, I put on a helmet for the very first time with bars. And if you look at your hand and just kind of focus on your hand and then try to look through the bars, it's really hard not to see the bars. So I wasn't allowed to play football growing up. I was a skinny kid, more of a track, long distance runner. And I went out there and I got just destroyed. I couldn't pass, I couldn't catch. Like I could pass and catch without a helmet, but you put a helmet on and then have guys swinging sticks at you. It's a lot harder.
Yeah, that's true.
I was quick to get to ground balls, and I'll never forget like picking up a ground ball, turning around and just getting blasted into a mud puddle and thinking, oh, you get to hit people. And, it was one of those moments where I had never played a contact sport like that, soccer, basketball, baseball, track. But it was a real awakening, and I had some great friends. We all ended up on the freshman sophomore team. We didn't win a game. We lost every game we played that freshman year, but I worked hard and made varsity the following year with a group of friends. I think 6 or 7 of us made varsity our sophomore year. And and it was it's been a great journey with lacrosse. I have great friends, and it was always about those relationships with friends.
So it's interesting how you stuck with it after the helmet experience and getting blown up into the mud pit and, picking it up and maybe not having so much immediate success with it to start, how you continued on and kept with it. Did you have coaches that really, shepherded you and helped you get better at it or pushed you in the sport?
Yeah, from the very beginning, even on that freshman sophomore team, we were kind of the bad news bears of players. But I'd Coach Carter and Coach Meredith Price, they were just wonderful mentors, wonderful, father figures in many ways when you were away at boarding school, and very supportive of, all of us, and just as we were developing, and great sense of humor. There was a humility in playing and losing every game. I mean, it was tough. But then over the summer, I went to university school's summer camp. And I had a great experience at that summer camp, and I really kind of fell in love with the game, that spring, that summer. And then, Coach Brian Teeple at university school, a longtime math teacher. So the irony of sort of the odyssey of coming full circle back to university school, is not lost on me. I think we all go through this journey in circles. So I made varsity, as I mentioned, sophomore year, and Paul Coxtime was an English teacher. He was a Princeton undergrad and just played club, but he was a scholar, Yale, masters in Milton, and would quote Shakespeare on the lacrosse field. So he was just this, and he a gentle giant too. He seemed like he was 6'7", but I think he's 6'4", 6'5", but he just was that, but rather stoic in many ways, but again, had a wonderful sense of humor. I lived in his dorm my senior year, a small dorm, and it was a real honor to be, invited to live in more or less under his roof with just 4 other students in the dorm side of the building. My sophomore year, I ended up breaking my hand. And I tell students, one of the reasons I care a lot about, we'll get into this, is meditation, is like, I was a very emotional, I had a lot of angst, I had a lot of frustrations, and I punched a mirror, just boxer's fracture. And I just looked at my hand, I'm like, that's not going to fit in a glove, and I sat out that whole sophomore season, and I had worked very hard. I had even gone on the university school spring break trip, and to prepare to make to try out for varsity, and I had made varsity that day, and I knew very early on, when you show up at Andover, like day one, they're like, welcome to Andover. For the first time, half of you are now in the bottom half of your class. Let that sink in. And I was an honors kid at Mayfield City Schools in Cleveland, and it was a public school, a very good school in many ways, but I was not prepared for French immersion. I was struggling in academically. So, those relationships, those mentors at Andover, Coach Modesti, the athletic director, assistant coach, Coach Bill Scott, I played soccer as well. And then in the winter, I did some, everything from pole vault my sophomore year to wrestling my junior year, and earned a couple letters there. But it was, those teachers, those coaches, and sort of the old school triple threat, like you're in, the counselors, the mentors, in the dorm. So it's a big reason why I've spent 11 of my 20 years at boarding schools. I love that holistic aspect, but it's good to be home at university school now.
So I imagine Andover is very similar to where I interned, and really what got me into teaching was Choate Rosemary Hall. I did a summer program there, and I was just thinking the whole time, this is ridiculous that people go to school here, because it's beautiful. The teachers were amazing. That we were doing afternoon. I was helping out with tennis and some lacrosse stuff, and I just loved it there. But I also know how competitive those, similar to the schools that we teach at now, how competitive those schools are. And what was it like for you kind of growing at Andover? It seems like freshman, sophomore year, you're figuring some things out and, adjusting to that environment. But how did you kind of get on track there and figure it out and grow as a student and an athlete at such a competitive place?
Yeah, and I was on like sort of double secret probation after I broke my hand. I was failing a number of classes. I had broke my right hand. I hadn't been writing, and then the second half of that trimester in the spring, I really doubled down. And then coming into my junior year, after being given a second chance to come back my junior year, um, I, uh, I think one of my best friends and I, made a point to, like, we were going to go to the library, right from practice, and really beginning to not just do the work, but really spend that extra time reading and learning, and sort of sequester ourselves, from, the dorm distractions and other things. So, I think, and having a friend to kind of, partner with, to, like, we got to make up for some of our lost time. And again, I had great teachers, great mentors who, when I saw them as not just sort of, teachers that are giving grades, but as someone I can go to and sit with my soccer coach, who is my calculus teacher, particularly senior year. I'm going through the college process, and I'm at his dinner table, reviewing calculus so I can do well in his course, because I'm looking at the Naval Academy, I'm looking at Penn and some other great schools, and Lacrosse had opened the door for me to have these conversations. But at the end of the day, I had to do well. But there's a lot of pressure then, but I think even greater pressure now, because it is for these universities, it's global competition. There's no secret about Choate and Andover now. To get into Andover today is and I was very fortunate, to go to a place like Andover, just as my uncles had gone to Andover, two of them on full financial aid. My grandfather and my grandmother were big readers, and my grandfather had read about Andover. And so when my dad lost his business, my uncle, who had gone there, he's an attorney now, very successful, gives back to Andover, said, hey, if you apply to Andover, you're doing well in middle school, you could get financial aid. And that worked out. And it worked out at Penn as well. But the pressure on students today, I can't imagine, and I think empathy is aspirational. I can't imagine, sort of the pressure and expectations to, get the perfect test scores, to get the perfect grades, and that notion to be perfect. I think of all the moments of grace and sort of second chances I had throughout high school, college, even, where, I think it can be high stakes, high pressure too often, all the time. And kids are going to make mistakes. And how do we support them through those mistakes when they feel they have to be perfect?
When you were at Andover, were you fascinated by English? Were you into that subject already, or was that something that really happened when you got to Penn and you started to kind of enjoy English classes and think maybe that was your area that you wanted to study?
I can't say enough about the English department at Andover. Like, I had incredible English teachers, and I think it was the personal connection that I had with my freshman English teacher in particular, my junior year, and then my senior year, I did a lot more creative writing. However, you may be familiar with the book Susan Cain, Quiet. I was as quiet as they come in the classroom, which is kind of ironic now that we're in an extrovert role as teachers, but I'm much more sort of lean, ambivert or introvert. So I'd rather read and write than speak up in class. So the class discussions were very intimidating, at Andover in particular. And I'll never forget, always getting those comments, needs to participate more, needs to speak up more. But I was of that mindset, like, I'd rather let them think I'm smart than, like, open my mouth and let them think otherwise. And I think I'm quoting Twain there, loosely there. But then I go to Penn my freshman year, and I had spent some time with my uncle, who was an orthopedic surgeon, And I don't know what I was thinking looking back. This is not a path to follow, but if it's like one of those sort of like dead end paths. So I decided I was going to take chemistry after never taking chemistry in college. And I mentioned calculus in high school was a challenge. And I was going to the Naval Academy, and I ended up not going to the Naval Academy because I said, look, I don't think the math and science is my path. But I remember reading Great Gatsby for the very first time and just kind of fell in love with the book, partly because of, personal high school girlfriend breakup and all that, and sort of had that daisy, and I tell students, you need to read The Great Gatsby after you've had your heart broken. It's a different book,
Mm-hmm.
and then
It's
I
fun.
just kind of mumbled under my breath, like someone was saying something, just kind of ripping the book, and I said, have you read the book? And I just like, I mean, it was a survey class of postmodern literature, and this was the high modern beginning, like to compare all the postmodern texts, and like all eyes just sort of like beamed on me, and I was like, did I say that out loud? And I had to like apologize and then defend why I disagreed with the novel. And then I was a participant in that conversation because instead of opening my mouth, here I have opened my mouth and I look like a real jerk, to put it mildly. I now had to speak up regularly. I had to be sort of in the arena, if you will, and having those conversations, because otherwise, like, this is not going to end well in many ways. So, but once I kind of got over that hump and I was really doing the reading, I can't say, yeah. So
Once you spoke out about that book, it probably became so much easier. You were now part of the discussion. You had the opinion.
yeah, yeah. And I was always a reader. Um, my uncles, my grandmother, my mom, my dad, all readers, and there would always be a recommendation. You'd get a stack of books usually from half price bookstore or other places for birthdays and Christmas. So there was always books. But I remember borrowing books from my uncle's bookshelf, and he had gone to Andover, and reading World According to Garp, and All the King's Men, and just loved reading. So the reading part was easy, and I could kind of have insights. But even right now, I pause because when I get nervous, I start to ramble, or I just get quiet. So, but just having that sort of awareness, like I need to be part of this conversation, and then. One of the things I loved about Bread Loaf was the conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are as teachers, but having these in-depth conversations beyond the classroom. I can't say that was the case in the locker room at Penn or on the bus at Penn, when most of my friends were off to Wall Street. Where I was one of two English majors at Penn. I was definitely the Thoreauvian different drummer.
It's funny.
So
It's funny to me how it was kind of Great Gatsby that struck you the most, and obviously you teach that every year. And for my classes, all the boys really enjoyed that reading and continue to enjoy that book. But it's funny that high school students love that book so much when it really is a book about like regrets in the past and heartbreak and kind of things that you really experience as you get older. I just think it's interesting how that book clicks so much with high school students, and it clicked with you.
and my view on the novel has evolved, and you read a lot of things about it, but on a language level, it's accessible. There's the Keatsian poetry that was inspired. Pausing there, I just had like a bottleneck of thoughts. But with Fitzgerald's own biography, you dig into his life and how he mirrored his fiction closely, thinly veiled autobiography in many ways. I will note that I feel more of a Nick affinity than Jay Gatsby, but there was something about Gatsby's almost arrested development, having, can't repeat the past and being stuck in the past. And it's a novel about letting go in many ways. That's the tragic flaw in many ways. He can't let go of the past. He's stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's painful to be like in that stuck phase. And I think that's what at that time resonated, where you want to go back into the past and like do things differently. But
Yeah, it's funny. I did extra credit opportunity since Fitzgerald spent so much time in Baltimore with Zelda at Hopkins. I did a extra credit opportunity, and I had no idea kind of how far his grave site was from where we are in Baltimore. But
is it in Columbia, Maryland? Is that
it's in Rockville, Maryland, which is a good,
Rockville? That's it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good 45 minutes to an hour away. But
Hmm.
I was like to my classes this year, if you guys want to go to Fitzgerald's grave, I'll give some extra credit. And I didn't know it would be, I went myself and I was like, wow, this is kind of takes up your whole afternoon. And
Hmm.
pretty much maybe half of my students all went out there on like little road trips out to Fitzgerald's gravesite, took their
Yeah.
pictures, but I think it's kind of a good memory for them to have, and they'll all read the
Hmm.
book again. So that book went really well this year, and continues to be a hit in American literature here.
Yeah. It reminds me of a colleague, Dr. Dan Dyer at West Reserve Academy. He's written professional book reviews, over 800 of them, for Kirkus, I think it is, the book reviews. But he has done pilgrimages to the grave sites, the birth sites of, and he will read, when writing a book review, everything by that author from start to finish, and then visit in his epic road trips. So um, I'm a little envious of that experience, but um, that definitely came up. Teaching. I'm curious. The Tom Buchanan character, uh, particularly the last few years, he's been more on my consciousness, and sort of his views. I think has offered a window into new conversations around race, and really sort of the whiteness that he speaks of in that. I don't know if that came up for you this year, or something.
Yeah, it definitely comes
That.
up in that. I guess it's the first chapter that you
Hmm.
notice that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and just his treatment of really everybody, but his
Hmm.
wife and
Yeah.
and the other characters, and just his philosophy. It's definitely an
Yeah.
interesting kind of window to talk
Yeah.
about some contemporary issues.
Hmm. Yes. Um, and I use we talk a lot about the windows and mirrors metaphor. How novels can be, whether the Gatsby in some ways is a mirror, and Nick in some ways is always kind of looking in the window, sort of as a voyeur, almost watching, this drama unfold as a narrator, an unreliable narrator. But that idea of windows and mirrors, I give credit to, do you guys have a national seed project with seeding educational equity and diversity?
I
It's
don't.
a faculty conversation. Um, I did some training with them at Milton Academy a few years ago, and it was transformational, to be part of that conversation, especially in light of this past year. But I know many schools are wrestling with. Um, I was curious about community, equity and inclusion. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, and I think that's a conversation that is ongoing and never ending. And it's been a challenging conversation, but it's an imperative to have these conversations.
So
So
what are those conversations like at the school that you're at now at university, and how is that playing out there?
I think one of the things that has helped with particularly with seed is having a space for faculty So it's a train the trainer program. So we went to Milton Academy. We spent 8 days learning about equity, inclusion, privilege, oppression, and then creating a forum for faculty to have conversations once a month around topics where we assume good intent, but bringing sort of awareness to the aspects of identity that may be sensitive to have conversations with, and a lot of it is having reflection time, journal time, and then pair and share and small group discussions, and then larger group discussions. It was obviously challenged this past year with Zoom. We started having these meetings during Zoom once a month, and it's a way, as we're wrestling with these questions and in many ways language around equity and inclusion. How do we define these values? And there's some clarity in having these conversations, because I think we all have assumptions, and then we have a moment to kind of look in the mirror, but also have a window into other experiences from a diverse group of faculty where you see different perspectives. So it's a wonderful place. I like this idea of safe space, brave space, and that's a book by John Palfrey, who is the former head at Andover, and Andover's done some great DEIJ work, and I've always kind of followed that work, from just having great mentors, from LGBTQ. There was a GSA founded in 1990, which is hard to imagine, a club like that being founded so long ago. But having these conversations around identity I think are imperative. And I think in many ways, our education, my education, there were gaps, there were some holes. So, as we listen to podcasts and listen to narratives, we gain those perspectives. But then by having conversations, that's where we create community of trust.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And I think you brought up that these conversations all really hit their peak during the COVID year. Had made it all the more difficult to actually be candid and listen and, and be in the same room. Really, I think the physical presence is something that's important to be with each other when you're having any type of conversation. But it was definitely difficult, or maybe more difficult for those conversations this year, but really just in class. And I don't know how university, did school this year, whether it was virtual or hybrid, or how you made that work as an English teacher in classes too. But I found it difficult to, my classes, probably similar to yours, are very conversationally based, and to have meaningful conversations and kind of get my students to be open with each other and comfortable over such a kind of awkward landscape this year was definitely a challenge, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, and looking back on it, I'm still sort of unpacking, and I journal a lot. I do my morning pages, and the questions like, what have we learned, this past year? Because I think in the moment, everyone was doing the best they could just to kind of get through. I know we had a transformation of our school where we had hybrid. We were in person. They added a fifth section, so it was just from a logistics standpoint. I teach ninth grade, 2 sections of ninth grade, and then instead of 2 sections of 11th grade, I had 3 sections of 11th grade. But I had 1 section with 16 students, and then 1 section with 8, and then 1 section with 8, because of logistics in and around the campus, where I'm doing with freshmen with, I had 15 and 16 freshman students, more stand and deliver, because they are in person with masks on, spread out at 8 feet long tables at the end of each table. So gone are the Harkness, sitting around a round table and having those conversations. And then you throw in the curveball of if a student has the sniffles, he's online. And we had a number of students who, particularly in the winter with hockey and quarantining, some even had COVID. At one point, I think I had, of that junior group, I had quite a few non-AP, and I had a number of hockey players in that group. I have maybe 7 on in person, and then 9 online. And some students were online the entire year. So I don't know about you, but that cognitive load of teaching the kids in masks and then asking students to open their homes up and turn their cameras on, and I think we can make assumptions about everyone has their own room. That's not always the case for our students, and we all did sort of the best we could. But that sacred space of sitting, the Socratic of sitting around the Harkness and having those conversations and facilitating those conversations, it's such a different dynamic.
Now
and how do you recreate that in this hybrid? And then we went all virtual just to finish November through January. We were all virtual, and then we came back in person.
For the rest of the year.
I credit the school for getting us through this year in person for the year.
Nice.
So,
oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Is there anything that maybe worked well for you this year virtually or through the hybrid learning, or anything that you learned during the COVID year of teaching English that you think you're going to take with you going forward into, assuming next year is all in person and normal? Is there anything that you think that will remain with you as a teacher?
I've been using journaling and sort of a mindfulness approach of giving students a question, a prompt, a quote. Friday we focus on journaling in terms of TGIF, what are 3 things you're grateful for? But this year, I think in terms of social emotional learning and emotional intelligence was, how are you feeling? And giving them, vocabulary. One of the podcasts that I listened to was Brene Brown's Unlocking Us, and she also has Dare to Lead. And I've bought a bunch of books based on conversations that of guests that she had. But this Dr. Marc Brackett at Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence has a book out called Permission to Feel, and giving them a mood meter of, okay, you're yellow, high energy, and pleasant, versus blue, low energy and unpleasant. And then red is high energy but unpleasant, and distinguishing, are you frustrated, or are you annoyed, or are you livid, and kind of giving them some vocabulary, as Marc Brackett would talk about, name it to tame it. And this idea of sort of on a 0 to 5 to 0 to -5, whereas the green is low energy. You're probably familiar with this.
I'm not actually. No, it's interesting. I've done similar journals or questions where I kind of ask how you're feeling or give me a color or something like that, yeah. But nothing as specific as these specific colors to measure your temperament.
And the colors is sort of a ground floor, base level, where you can kind of begin there, but to give them some emotional intelligence to really name their own feelings, because it was an emotional roller coaster for all of us. The Zoom's not working, you're dropping kids left and right on the Zoom, and there were just so many different challenges this past year. To have that self-awareness of my own, am I frustrated or am I annoyed, to how do we shift our mood and state but then also to translate that to the text. How do you start to use these, terms to help identify the, characters and what they're feeling? Okay, what can you infer into what is said? And the irony is, this is what they're really feeling, and giving them some language around that. So again, like name it to tame it, but also just asking students like, what's on your mind? Kind of coaching them on like, what's on your mind? What else is on your mind? Because when you only have like a voice on a Zoom screen and you just get like, good, fine, whatever,
Yep.
like you have to kind of follow up and stay connected and be curious. It was a very humbling year because most of our communication is nonverbal. Like you can read a room when a bunch of boys come in and like different vibes, and sort of the advantage of being in class with certain boys versus the disadvantage of being home on Zoom, maybe even all year, isolated, mental health issues are inevitable, when you feel that removed. So spending more time just checking in, then because you have to have that conversation, even if it's just that first 10 minutes. Let's take a minute, get clear on like what's on your mind, what else is on your mind, like what is the greatest challenge for you right now, and then having a student just naming their greatest challenge right now, and having the courage to like share that. And you mentioned the word like comfortable, and I think one of the phrases like choosing courage over comfort. And I think, how do we mindfully like take that deep breath when we feel uncomfortable so that we can have these conversations and take the risk of being like, no, seriously, how are you really? And kids will open up, some kids will not open up, but to know that people care and they're not alone. And I shared my story about losing my brother Connor to bipolar and suicide. That was such a real concern, for their health and well-being. So that's something particularly this year, but even moving forward, I think, having, the ruler approach to recognize, understand, label, and have real empathy for students that like, I can't imagine what it's like to be at home and Zooming and the FOMO you might be experiencing not to be in the building right now, but you're sacrificing, being home because for your family, and for your grandmother, you're home. And that's the choice I would make, if I were in a multi-generational home, so you can't fault the kid for being at home and Zooming. Yeah, there's just so many aspects of this year where we really had to rethink and reflect and say, what assumptions do I have at play right now? Kid just wants to be at home. And sure, there are some kids that like didn't wake up in time, so they just flicked on the Zoom and took a day off. And hey, maybe that's what he needed. Who knows?
So I think,
like, who am I to?
I think this conversation is so important because I was feeling the same way from when COVID hit to, throughout the year, just, thinking about what it's like to be on Zoom all day long. And then after your Zoom, you have to complete all your homework. And, in a lot of cases, your teachers aren't really maybe understanding or balancing their workload. They're probably trying to get the same amount done as typically would during the school year, but thinking about the students and having to look at a screen all day and then continue to look at a screen to complete your homework, that really takes a toll on your mental health, your well-being. I'm curious, as a teacher, is there, in addition to questions and checking in and trying to understand the emotions of your students, is there anything that, tips or advice? Because I know that you meditate a lot, you do a lot of yoga, you keep all of this important stuff in mind in your own life. Is there anything that you advised your students to do on a daily basis during this difficult year to to help them out? And is there anything that really worked for your students after giving them some kind of advice or feedback, or, some ways to handle such a tough time?
When I think of like advice, like I don't think it was necessarily advice, but more, asking questions. What are you looking forward to? Asking questions like, what are you grateful for? And not grateful like you should be grateful in a shaming way, because we can use like gratitude as like you should be grateful for this opportunity, and you have all the advantages of going to a school, so to be kind of aware, but I think just to listen more, and hold some space for students to even have. We had 85-minute classes. So we went from, sort of that gauntlet of like 7 classes, 45 minutes with some extended blocks in the middle, to just 4 classes every other day, sort of like an A day, B day, A day, B day, alternating. But that 85-minute, there were some advantages. You can kind of slow things down and then do some work in class. But in so many words, the question is like, what does self-care look like for you? For some it's gaming, because if they're gaming, and I have my opinions about gaming in excess, but if they're socializing through games, that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I always like to kind of come back to this expression my dad said about like, garbage in, garbage out. He was a computer science, information systems guy, and he, more polite way of saying that is, you are what you eat. So just be mindful of your intakes,
Mm-hmm.
and talking about, how important sleep is, and sleep is a health imperative, and what happens to the brain when you don't sleep. So my course this year, not a life skills class, but I think using literature to connect, using poetry, and particularly in April, to give voice to feelings and thoughts and stories that may not be represented otherwise, or articulated, like that Frost notion of the lump in the throat. That's what poetry gives language to that. The year, I feel like I'm just coming out of it.
Mm-hmm.
We're still having this conversation. I don't even know if I'm ready to have this conversation. Like, I don't know what worked. We got through it, and doing more reflecting so we can redesign a better year next year. But we are, fortunate to have the vaccine, and to have more normalcy moving forward. So, but this was a huge wake up call in so many ways this past year. If we don't kind of reflect even on the painful things, especially on the painful things, the frustrating things this past year, there's no real learning.
So I'm interested in some ways that you personally kind of check in with yourself. And you talked about journaling and gratitude, and I know you're big into yoga and meditation, but I'm curious about your own practices and some of the things that you do that really help you mentally, and maybe what you do when you journal, like what that looks like. Are you just kind of writing your thoughts and your feelings and checking in with yourself, or do you have a certain practice that you do every morning?
I journal a lot, as just throughout. I picked up a Moleskine journal when I went to Oxford for the first time, or first time I traveled internationally. I was awarded a grant, and I was able to go to Oxford and study Shakespeare, and 20th century poetry. So I found, in the town of Oxford, a bookstore that sold Moleskine journals. So I've been doing that for a long time. This past year, I really adopted The Artist's Way, by Julia Cameron, and I have it like right here, like morning pages journal, and just sort of a brain dump, just to kind of get whatever is going on, and then I can kind of like even create the to-do list from that. But just to kind of let all the things that are circling up, settle. Yoga was a New Year's Day. I was living in New York City. I lost my brother February 26th, 2000, and here was New Year's Day, January 1st, 2001. And the night before, I was talking to someone, and he was seeing someone who was a yoga instructor, and I was training for a second marathon, and I was complaining about my back, and he said, you should try this yoga class out. So I went to this class, and it happened to be Elena Brower, and a Cornell graduate, and it was a Cornell lacrosse player who had recommended the class, and it was a huge emotional relief, because I was dealing with a lot of grief at that time, having lost my brother, and we can process grief in a lot of unhealthy ways. And I'll just say that this was the first time I felt some peace, and the shame, the blame, the guilt, the regret, all of that and I just literally cried on my mat. One of the jokes is I always felt like sort of like this big lacrosse player, and I was bigger than kind of going in and like George Costanza at the model party. Like I did not belong there, but it was a very strict kind of practice. Like I just put my head down in child's pose, did my class, cried on my mat, rolled it up, left, usually didn't make eye contact with anyone. And it was a real gift. And I'm kind of getting goosebumps because I still remember like those first few classes. And that's been a gift for the last, 20 plus years now. And it was something that was scoffed at, and I'd bring it up, and, I kind of get the side eye, like whatever. And it's been something that led to meditation. I started meditating with a TM teacher right before Bread Loaf, when I was taking some really tough classes. My personal practice is sort of like that 20 minutes and 20 minutes twice a day. That doesn't always happen. The reality of, things, you don't always have that luxury of that time. So even 5 to 10 minutes. But at Bread Loaf, there was a real luxury. After a morning class, before lunch, I think it was at 12:30, I would sit behind, looking out onto the beautiful, field, and just sit for 20 minutes, then go to lunch and be present at lunch, and kind of let all the ideas and all the questions and all the stress of like, I got to write a paper on this, and everything kind of settled. And then we'd have these monster, 2.5 hour or 2 to 5 p.m. classes. And I would meditate after those, and I'd go to dinner. And it just gave me a sense of like calm and clarity, where if I don't do that, people will recognize it, so it helps me to connect dots, and just to let all of there's a great video, mindfulness video, Just Breathe, that idea of like the snow globe, everything gets, stirred up, and then everything just kind of settles. So get ready for Bread Loaf. My advice, just meditate, like just sit there. Don't overcomplicate it. Listen to your breath. Your thoughts will come and go like clouds, and just come back to the next inhale.
Oh, sorry, something popped up.
No worries.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Bread Loaf is virtual gotta do it
Oh,
again.
is it? I was curious.
Yeah, it's virtual this summer. So, oops, sorry, we're having some issues here. So yeah, it's gonna be online, but I'm so excited to actually. I don't even know what the campus or anything looks like. I'm kind of, I'm gonna do this summer. My sister just moved out to Seattle, Tacoma area in Washington, so I'm gonna go out there, which I'm sure it's maybe a similar feel to the mountain landscape,
Yeah.
but I'm excited to actually get on campus next summer and see what it's all about.
Yeah. Ripton, Vermont. Bread Loaf. There's nothing quite like it. It was a real gift, because I was a work study Division I, athlete in college, and the luxury at grad school to kind of sit and have these conversations with professors, with students, fellow teachers from all over the country was a real luxury. So I'm curious to hear how that goes. Because I think so much of the place and the sense of community. How do you replicate that in a virtual space?
Mm-hmm.
If done well, it can be powerful, and you get to travel and do Seattle and do a lot of things. And my hope is that you'll get to Vermont. I did a summer at the Alaska campus. I never did Oxford through Bread Loaf. I did Exeter College through a different program, but
so I think they might have gotten rid of the Alaska, because that's the first time I'm hearing about Alaska.
Yeah, that was summer of like 2004 or 5, 2004, I think. That was my first summer because Vermont was full. But
and was that a really rich experience in Alaska for the first summer of the program?
It was really unique. I had never been out there. I flew out there. I didn't have a car. You were at the Juneau campus of Southeast Alaska University, and I studied that particular summer. Interestingly enough, another postmodern class, and then also American romanticism, transcendentalism. So a lot of Emerson and Thoreau, and to be walking, in sort of the mountains there of Juneau. We were set up away from campus, but it was a great community of just 60 students. So it was very small and rather intimate. But what I loved about Bread Loaf is the barn and the guest speakers and lecturers that would come, the writers that would come, and to have that experience, and then to read poetry my senior year from the same lectern as Seamus Heaney. I missed Seamus Heaney's visit by a couple of years, but I heard that was magical. One of my favorite classes was Victor Luftig. Anything with Victor Luftig I recommend, and they're all wonderful, but I give a special shout out to Victor Luftig at University of Virginia. And he taught a course, Seamus Heaney in context. So we looked at all of his poetry and the historical context in Northern Ireland, and really an incredible experience. Great group of people.
I'm sure you formed so many relationships there that you still keep in touch with your classmates and.
I lived off campus my last year. And I think that's one of the one things I would recommend not doing. If you it was nice to live in Middlebury. There was an apartment that was available through happenstance. So I was like, yeah, that would be great. But I think we missed out on a lot of the socializing that last year. But yes, I still have a handful of friends. That we stay in touch and we talk. So it's but there's something about like just the whole community. Like when you see someone who's gone to Bread Loaf, there's those fond feelings that come up and for the experience. So it's a great community that's ongoing. And one of my dreams is someday to be an older student taking that master's in literature that they created. Just
true. Yeah.
Maybe with a specialty in creative writing. We'll see.
So I'm sure this question has a lot of different answers, but I'm curious how your experience at Bread Loaf impacted your career as a teacher, and what ways that you maybe changed as a teacher after going to Bread Loaf.
I think it's the one-on-one conversations I have with professors. To sit down with a professor and kind of walk through an essay, and some professors did that more so than others, but to have those writing conferences. I think writing is very personal to teach it in mass to a large group. But I had a poetry class with Paul Muldoon. Um, again, my last year, and there were just a dozen students in the class, and he would sit and talk and conference with us and read with us, and give us feedback. And uh, so I like to have those one-on-one conversations where, obviously you make the comments on essays, but not to be cynical, but like far too often they just want to know the grade,
Mm-hmm.
versus I rather have the conversation. So when you have those writing conversations, when you kind of in that conversation go, oh, and then you start to see the structure and the organization and sort of the clarity. So
Yeah, that's actually something that I've been even trying to do now. It's so time intensive, but I think it's so much easier for me to sit down with someone and tell them what's going on with their essay or their paper. Whereas if I kind of just I could spend so much time putting comments on there and writing notes, but in reality, how many of my students are going to read through all of my short paragraphs of feedback, when if you just meet with me for 10 minutes, I could talk you through but it does take time, obviously, and well enough about that. But
when I was at Western Reserve Academy, there was a water fountain right across from my classroom, and it was disheartening. There was also a recycling bin right there, and you give back the essays, and then you look over after getting a sip, and you look and you're like, all those hours are now recycled. So it made me rethink those, and lean more towards the conversations. Um, and I will also say, Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, in Janet Burway's book, Writing Fiction. I had the pleasure of working with Patricia Powell, a novelist and instructor, for not just a creative writing class, but also an independent writing project. And she talked about the just getting it down, the downdraft of Anne Lamott's like shoddy first drafts, and it's a different word, but you want to keep it. And to just have that downdraft, and then you can fix it up later. And recommending to students, I shouldn't be the first person to be reading this essay out loud to you. So that usually gets them in the habit of, I want you to, and I'll even say like a choir, read your essay out loud. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. And they're reading it out loud. I'm like, is there anything you'd like to change? And they're like, yeah, okay, let's take 15 minutes, make those changes, because you can hear it.
mm-hmm.
They have a gap between what's on the page and what's in their head. So once they read it with fresh eyes after they wrote it, God knows what hour, and the wee hours of the morning, it's a very different essay when they read it out loud. So I've gotten into that. So I'm not sitting down to have a writing conference and they haven't read it out loud.
Yeah, that's a great
Because you
idea.
can catch a lot of those things, like kind of like reading, playing music by ear, writing by ear.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So when you went to Western Reserve Academy, what was the kind of decision there as a first teaching job? How did that come to fruition, your decision to go to that school and get into teaching?
well, there's the Skip Flanagan, the head of school at Western Reserve Academy, um, and it actually goes back. My very first teaching job was at St. Andrew's Episcopal School, and I came in mid-year as a head lacrosse coach, and I was there for 4 lacrosse seasons, 3.5 years, and then I interviewed with Carney Sando, and I had aspirations at that time to go back to Andover, and I met with like Brewster and Tabor and a number of other schools, but Western Reserve Academy made me a wonderful offer, and and my brother Connor had gone there as a student. And my brother Connor really struggled with mental health starting his freshman year. And then he repeated his freshman year at Andover and then had a sophomore year at Andover. But then he came back to the Mayfield Public School. So he skipped his 11th grade year. So, and then he took a postgraduate year at Western Reserve Academy. And I think part of it was personal. It was close to home, just 40 minutes from my mom and dad. And many of my soon-to-be colleagues came up to me and be like, "Your brother was a sweet boy." The track coach, said, "Your brother was one of the best athletes I've ever seen." And he played basketball, soccer, and lacrosse at a very high level, and he played at lacrosse at Ohio Wesleyan. But he struggled with bipolar, and we didn't really understand what that was in the early 90s. So it was, something that, we know a lot more about now. And, I just, certainly, after 9/11, I left New York City to teach. But really, my brother has always kind of been, has given me a gift in terms of like not a spidey sense, but a keen awareness of like when a kid's struggling, like, or if a kid's acting in a certain way that's not him, like, talk to me, and just those words, like, come on, talk to me, what's going on? And he'll tell you one version of the story, and then it's like, what else is on your mind? What else is going on? And you just never know, because my brother was a great actor. Like, no one knew he was depressed, and it was easier to say he had mono because mental health and the stigma around mental health has moved forward, but still there's a lot of myths about sort of bootstraps and suck it up, and especially as a young boy, as an athlete, and we can and how we use shame to kind of motivate kids, to let it go, move on. And it's not always so simple. It's a holistic approach to mental health and well-being. And I pause there because I think, as we move forward, how do we live well? How do we, make everyone feel part of the community and welcomed in the community? And how do our words matter in making, families and loved ones and, feeling connected and not alone? So, so a lot of these equity and inclusion conversations, it's more than just like terms, equity and inclusion. It's like, how do we, make people feel loved and known and loved. Known and loved is the motto at university school. Every boy should feel known and loved. But how do we, demonstrate that in our actions? We can profess to these values, but how do we show that?
Yeah, I'm thinking, are there certain ways? I'm just thinking about some of my students and trying to, for me, these past 3 years of teaching, just get them to like open up a little bit more and kind of share these things. And I'm just thinking about, are there certain ways you can, tell something that is going on, or is it really just a kind of a feel thing, or like their vibrations, or it's hard to get teenagers to kind of open up, I think, in that way sometimes.
Yeah. And I think, I think a lot of the work starts from within, to be holding space. And I don't want to get into like vibrations or like, it's an intuitive thing. Because I think if we're conscious of our own, thoughts and emotions and assumptions that we're making, the more self-awareness we have, we're not, Harvard has a great Project Zero, of just being with someone without coming in with like the advice, like you should do this, and like projecting this whole story of expectations. You have everything to be grateful for. Like you're at Gilman, like you should be happy. And, happiness isn't that simple. Wellness isn't that simple. Obviously there's like specific things, that may occur. But I think, tell me more. What's going on? I think it's just a conversation and taking a risk to have that conversation and then stepping back and listening. And in someone who wants to give a lot of advice, there's a lot of humility in just saying, I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes. Help me understand. I can't imagine. And you may know like tips of the iceberg, or that Hemingway iceberg theory, like what is said and the irony beneath the surface. We don't know. So you have to ask. And being young as a teacher, I think what a wonderful opportunity to just have that courage to have that conversation, and students will open up to you more so, because they may have a feeling of like being you're a mirror to them in a way that like someone, further along in their career may seem like maybe, that may look like their dad or look like their mom, and they may not want to open up to it like an adult. But I think a younger teacher, in some ways you can have those conversations. But I think there is wisdom, as I say to my students, like, thank you, I've learned more from you than I've taught. And I think the further along I go on there is like, the more I read, the more I listen, the less I know. So be humble with that. Yet I still strive to read and listen, in a way. So there's things we know, there's things we don't know, and there's blind spots, things we don't know. And then there's things we know, we don't know, but once we are able to name those things that we know, but we can't really articulate it, when students are able to like they know something's off, but you don't know what it is, you have to have that conversation. But you'll never hit those blind spots. And this is for everything that we're kind of facing right now, is like, there's so much we don't know, especially if you go back to like March, going into the pandemic, the uncertainty, no one knew the answers to any of this. So how do we live with that uncomfortable uncertainty? What a mindfulness practice this has been. And how do you, day in and day out, today I'm going to choose courage over comfort. I'm going to ask, how you doing? And sometimes we don't want to know. Fine. Do you really want to know? So be prepared.
So Kevin, I'm curious what your, I know I asked you for a book recommendation. You probably thought of about 100, but is there one that you're reading now or looking forward to reading this summer, or a book that has really impacted you that you can maybe share with people who are going to view this?
Yeah, I think there's a whole reading list from Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. One of which I'm looking at it is Dr. Pippa Grange. And I think in a world of fear, this idea of fearless, how to win at life without losing yourself. And she worked with the national soccer team for England in 2018. And it's a great sport. She's a great sports psychologist. And that's a great book. And I have to pull up, the advice trap. And I say, like, these are some of the key words that have been kind of guiding me, and the questions that they have there. I think, I think there's a lot of wonderful books to be reading right now around DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Robert Livingston's book, The Conversation, is recognizing first, the problems that we have, not wanted, and historically what we've taught, And I think having the conversation and recognizing first and foremost what the problems are. And we tend to live in these myths of being colorblind. So a new Jim Crow is an incredible book to read. Um, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's work is, I think I have to give him a shout out. And then Clint Smith as an English teacher, he just got his Ph.D. from Harvard, and he just had a new book come out. And then there's Priya Parker, how we gather, and I think there's a wonderful opportunity in this time of transition and transformation going online. Here we are having a conversation via Zoom, that we are more connected than ever before. Yet how have we grown more disconnected? So, so I kind of go back to this idea of listening first, reading, and then processing and getting some clarity around, my own self-awareness. But, fear has been palpable in so many ways and will continue. But I think this emotional intelligence, permission to feel with Marc Brackett. So I can't name just one, but I guess just read, and I think we're so digitally distracted. How do we disconnect from our devices to read an actual book? Sometimes it feels like a luxury, but I think it's sort of a necessity.
Absolutely, it sounds like a whole stack of books for the summer, which is great. And
yeah.
Kevin, I really appreciate your time today. I wish we had more time to talk on here, but it was an awesome conversation. It was great to see you face to face, quote unquote, instead of on the phone. Yes. But thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was awesome.
Jake, thank you so much for asking questions and having me here and letting me ramble. Forgive me if I rambled too much, but
no way.
I wish you the best at bread Loaf virtually, and we'll talk soon.
Talk soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you later.
Be well.